Shalom, everyone. I'm Josiah Geoffrey,
I'm Hosea Geoffrey.
and we're back discussing the Torah portions. This week, we're covering the portion Lekh-L'kha, which is from Genesis 12:1 to 17:27. We've already read the portion ahead of time, so if you'd like to read it as well, you can go ahead and pause the video right now, and we'll get into discussing.
Lekh-L'kha begins to discuss the story of Abraham, the father of the people of Israel. It begins with his call into the land of Canaan, which his descendants would eventually come to inherit, and then covers the next 10 years of Abraham's life, including his brief sojourn in Egypt, as well as his separation from Lot, and his battle against kings, and the birth of his first son, Ishmael, as well as the covenants made with him, which would eventually be the framework for the covenant with the people of Israel.
So this portion begins with God's call of Abraham to leave his father's house and to leave the country where he was living, and God promises to make him a great nation. Right off the bat, it says some really important things about Abram and his descendants. In verse 3, it says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Right here, we see immediately that God has a big plan for Abram's descendants. And not only is that plan something that means that other people who bless or curse his descendants will be blessed or cursed, but the call of Abram's descendants is to bless all the families of the earth. It's something really important that I don't know if a lot of people really grasp, but God's call of Abram and his descendants wasn't for their own sake. He called them for the sake of all the families of the earth.
Later, Israel's called a kingdom of priests. The role of Israel is not just to be for God, but to be holy for God for everyone else.
Right.
To bring all the nations which were against God close to him. We saw the scattering of all the nations last portion in Babel. And this one nation is the nation that can bring everyone back to God.
Right.
So really, the entire foundation of what Israel is based on this promise here.
Right.
And so this promise to Abram it's not just the promise to Abram,
Right.
but his response that makes the promise possible. This is very similar to in the previous portion. God says to Noah,
Build an ark.
"Here's a thing for you. I will establish my covenant with you." And then after the flood, he establishes the covenant.
Right.
Here we have a promise of what God's going to do.
Right.
But the actual covenant is going to come later, which we're going to see.
But right off the bat, before God does anything else, the first thing he does before promising Abram anything is telling him what to do, which is to leave.
Right.
And in verse 4, we immediately see Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. So just like Noah, he did all the things according to what God had commanded.
Right.
Over and over again it said that, as we noted in the last video. Abram here does the same thing, and he shows that faithfulness to do what God has asked.
God called him to go, and he went, but God did not tell him where he was going. God just told him, "Leave. I will show you where you're going to be."
Right.
So Abram's acting in faith. It says that Abram already had possessions and people they had acquired in Haran.
Yeah.
So by going, he was leaving a place where he was already well established to go, he didn't know where. And so that required faith. He believed that God would protect him and show him the way.
Right.
Enough that he was willing to leave behind everything he had.
Yeah, leave behind...
I mean, he took his possessions with him.
He
leave behind
his
the
family.
place where he was.
He left behind his family. The only family that he took is his nephew Lot and his wife. But he didn't bring his brothers or his father.
His father was dead. It does say that.
Okay.
In Acts.
Okay.
I mean, it says right here, Terah died in Haran.
Okay.
After
Oh,
Terah
it says
died,
that at the last verse of the previous
Right.
portion, right?
So, yes, in the last portion, we were told briefly that Terah
Moved to Haran.
taking Abram and Lot. And then
Okay.
Terah died, and Abram and Lot continued to Canaan. He was already...
And it does say to go forth from your country and from your relatives. But whatever the case, he did leave his relatives.
He did leave relatives. This call was actually, according to Acts, before he even came to Haran, this was in Ur.
Okay.
So he got the call. He and Terah and Lot left Nahor.
Okay.
And then Terah died in Haran. Then they settled in Haran till Terah died, and then they continued to Canaan.
Okay.
And when they were finally at Canaan, that was when God said, "This is the spot.
Mm.
This is the land that belongs to your offspring, to your seed."
Okay.
And when Abram arrived there, he built an altar, but then he kept moving.
Yeah.
He kind of just moved all around Israel.
But there's one verse that I really want to point out, which is the same verse as the one with the altar. But at the beginning of the verse, it says, "The Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your descendants, or to your seed, I will give this land.'" This is the first time that God promised the land to Abram. And throughout this portion, we're going to see multiple times that God promises this. He repeats that promise over and over again, making it more firm each time. And so we'll get into that more as the portion goes on. But this is a really key feature of this portion, is God's calling him away from his relatives, but then he's giving him the land of Canaan.
Yeah, every time he makes this promise, every time he promises the land, he gets more specific, more emphatic, really just confirming it and refining the promise.
Right.
Until the end of near the end of the chapter, when it will get much more precise. But after he had been in Canaan for a little while, a famine struck.
Right.
And so he actually left the land
to go to
Egypt. I mean, God didn't tell him, once you get to the land, stay in the land. But it still seems like there's this motivation of concern. I mean, Abram's the head of the house now.
Right.
So
it's his job to take care of everybody.
So he's going down to Egypt. And when he gets there, he's afraid of the Egyptians, that they're going to
kill him and take his wife.
So it's interesting. On the one hand, you have Abram full of faith. On the other hand, you have him afraid. So afraid that he's like, "I'll just let him take my wife. I can't really do anything about that. Maybe they'll spare my life if I just lie and say she's my sister, and then they'll let me live." I hope. So it's like, it's weird. It seems like a fearful thing to do.
Yeah, it is very odd. And what makes it even more odd is that when he was acting in fear and he lied, he wasn't the one who got in trouble. Pharaoh got in trouble. God struck Pharaoh and his house with plagues.
I mean, what I see there is God's already picked Abram, and he's blessing Abram.
Right.
He blessed him before he went to Canaan. He blessed him in Haran. He's blessing him in Egypt. God is with Abram.
Right. Seemingly no matter what he does.
Yeah. And that shows Abram's not a perfect guy.
Right.
But because he has faith, God is with him.
Right. Right.
And, when his lie is discovered, Pharaoh realizes she's his wife.
He doesn't
hurt him.
He doesn't kill him and take his wife
he
was
doesn't.
Afraid of.
That's the interesting thing. He was afraid, but with God with him, did he really need to be afraid? I mean, we're going to see in a little bit that kings aren't a thing for Abraham to be afraid of.
Right.
What we have is Abram gets sent out of Egypt against, basically, God didn't tell him to leave Canaan.
Right.
It doesn't say God was upset with him, and it doesn't show God punishing him.
To go back.
But he ends up exactly back where he started.
Yeah.
It says he went
to exactly the same spot, to the same altar and everything.
Right.
Same place he pitched his tent.
So he left Canaan.
Right.
And a result is just
She's
God's,
my sister.
Yeah.
And then right back where you
God's
started.
like, no, that's where you are.
You're back where you started, but with more stuff now.
Oh, yeah.
I noticed when I read it, Abram's in the promised land. And then due to unforeseen circumstances, he ends up leaving to Egypt. And then later he'll return back to the land. And I noticed that this same pattern is repeated later. We'll see it later in the Torah. The people of, Jacob and his descendants, Jacob being Israel, lives in the land of Canaan. Then he and his descendants go to Egypt. And then after Moses delivers them, they leave, and then they'll come back to the land of Israel. And this same pattern is repeated with the Master Yeshua himself. It records that after Yeshua was born, Herod was looking to kill Yeshua. And so Yeshua's parents took him to Egypt. And he waited there until the bad things had passed over. And I believe I referenced this verse in a previous video, but Hosea chapter 11 says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," referring to Israel and referring to Yeshua. So it's just an interesting thing looking at the same pattern that you see with Yeshua and you see with the people of Israel, beginning with our father Abraham.
So one thing you said that I want to look at really briefly is you said that God afflicted Pharaoh with plagues. Is the word for plagues here the same as the plagues that God sent on Egypt later?
Well, let's take a look. The word for plague is nega. It looks like the word nega is used, yet one more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and Egypt.
So there you have an addition to the parallel between what Abraham experiences here and what we'll see later with Israel. He goes down to Egypt.
He's initially shown favor.
And when he loses, and then God sends plagues to Pharaoh. And then he goes back out with much possessions.
Of Egypt with much possessions back to the promised land.
Yep. So there's some more parallels.
Yeah. Pretty weird.
So Abram is back in the land with Lot. I assume he took Lot with him into Egypt. Oh yeah, that's what it says right here in verse 1. Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him.
Right.
So Lot was with him in Egypt when they went out. And when they're back in the promised land, at this point, they've collected so much stuff that God's blessed them so much that they don't
fit.
Yeah, the land's not big enough for the two of them. So no hard feelings. Abram's like, Lot, we need to separate. Yeah. This is becoming a problem. So pick whatever direction you want to go, and I'll go the other way.
Right.
So Lot kind of has his pick of the whole region.
Right. And he picks Sodom.
Yeah, Sodom of all places. He chooses it because it looks well watered.
It's very fertile.
Yes. So it looks like a good place to be prosperous and lush and green. Yay. And while it looks all good and happy on the outside, it says the people of Sodom
were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord.
Right. So he picked the path of apparent prosperity, and underneath it was full of wickedness.
Right.
And so that's going to end up having consequences for Lot later on.
Well, even very early on, because in the next chapter, so that was chapter 13. In chapter 14, we learn that a bunch of kings are going to war, and Lot ends up getting kidnapped when Sodom is attacked. So right off the bat, where he chose to go did not end up being good for him, and Abram had to come to his rescue.
And I find it very interesting that Abram doesn't even have a kid yet. Right. He's not even close to being a nation. And yet
he has enough people to take on multiple kings at once.
Right. The affairs of these nations and kings are suddenly thrust into Abram's life.
Right.
And Abram's suddenly on a level plane with all the nations.
Right.
He's a nation. He's practically a nation already, and he doesn't even have a son.
Yeah, and I mean, this wasn't super long after. I mean, this was kind of. It wasn't many generations from the Tower of Babel, probably. So it's feasible that all the nations were not too big at this point yet. But still, the fact that he's on a level with Pharaoh in the last chapter, he's on a level with multiple kings here, and he's fighting them and he wins. It just shows how much God has already blessed Abram, and he's already starting to deliver on his promise to make him a great nation.
And as if to confirm that, he sends a most peculiar person to Abram.
Here we meet Melchizedek, or in Hebrew, Melchizedek. Not a lot is said here about Melchizedek. It just says that he's the king of Salem and a priest of God Most High. So, first off, we'll just preface this by saying that the book of Hebrews actually goes a lot into discussing Melchizedek and discussing his implications on Yeshua and his call as a priest. And so what Hebrews starts out by saying is that the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and king of Salem means king of peace. But Salem is actually an old-timey name for Jerusalem. So right here we already see a specialness about the city of Jerusalem, because that's where God's priest comes from. God's priest king. So right here we already see Melchizedek being a weird archetype for Yeshua, in that he's the king in Jerusalem who is a priest of God.
Right.
That's not a combination that you see very often in Scripture.
Now, Melchizedek is a special priest because he's the only priest of God that we know of before Yeshua himself who's not of the tribe of Levi. So it puts him in a very unique position because Moses says only Levites can be priests.
Right.
But Melchizedek is of what Hebrews calls a different order.
That actually comes from the Psalms.
David prophesies of Messiah that God says, I've set you as a Kohen, a priest, eternal, according to the order of Melchizedek.
Right.
Immediately we see Melchizedek's a priest, but he's a different kind of priest.
Right, than what you see later in Torah.
The difference, one of the differences, is that he's eternal. So he's of a greater order. One of the other things is here, the relationship between Melchizedek and Abram. Levi is a descendant of Abram, and he serves on account of his brothers. But Melchizedek blesses Abram, and Abram gives tenths to Melchizedek. Abram is a father of Levi, but he's submitting.
If Abram is a father of Levi, that makes him greater than Levi. And Abram is the one who's giving to Melchizedek, which means Melchizedek is even greater than Abram.
Right. So it shows that Abram, in his faith in God, also submitted to the priest of God. It shows his attitude toward Messiah, even though he hadn't, obviously, Messiah hadn't come yet.
Right.
But, Yeshua says,
Abram saw my day and he rejoiced.
Right.
Yeah.
So
we'll see that more in future portions.
Right.
But whatever the case, Hebrews goes a decent amount into what makes the order of Melchizedek different and better than the order of Levi through Aaron. So what chapters would those be?
That's Hebrews 7, if you want to read more.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. We can't go into all of it right now, but we just covered the basic highlights. But yeah, go read Hebrews 7. It's got a lot of really good stuff here that really brings out how Melchizedek is a really good archetype for the coming of Yeshua.
So after meeting Melchizedek and returning from the battle with the kings.
Mm.
The next thing we're told about Abram is that God shows up to him again. And he begins to promise to Abram again. But in this case, Abram, instead of just being like, okay, cool, he's showing some concern because at this point, it's been a while.
And he's still...
And he's only getting older.
Right.
And he says, I have no son. I still have no son. The heir of my house is...
some other dude from Damascus.
Right. So how am I going to be a nation?
Right. And God's reply is, that dude from Damascus is not going to be your heir. I'm going to give you a son.
Abram's, on the one hand, expressing apprehension and maybe a little doubt. And he's wondering how. And how am I supposed to know?
Right.
But God says, it's going to happen. Your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars.
Right.
And Abram believes it.
Right.
He chooses to believe.
And the next verse is a really key verse. It says that Abram believed in Adonai, in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So right here, this is very important. Abram's belief by itself was considered righteousness by God. It was credited to him. It was reckoned to him. Abram didn't do anything to earn that righteousness. He just believed God, and that was enough to be considered by God to be righteous. Later in Paul, in the New Covenant scriptures, he points to this verse to show that all believers in Yeshua are children by faith of Abraham because they're following after this same pattern, believing in God. And that's all that's necessary for righteousness. We don't earn our own righteousness because we can't. All that we can do is believe God, and then he will credit that righteousness to us.
We already saw earlier that the faith that Abram has is the kind which he will take action on when God tells him to do that.
Right.
On the other hand, we've seen that he's not perfect.
Right. None of us are.
Right, exactly. But in this case, God didn't tell him to do anything. It was just believe. And Abram did that. That was all he needed to do.
Right.
The things he did before don't really matter.
Right.
They showed the character of Abram, but they're not the reason that this is being made with him.
Right.
It's simply that he believed. That's the righteousness that God is about to make a covenant with him on account of that righteousness.
Right. So right after God promises a son, and then Abram believes him, then we see the establishment of the covenant. He tells Abram to lay out a sacrifice, and I don't think it explicitly calls it a sacrifice here, but whatever the case, he's slaughtering some animals and laying them out. And then when darkness comes that night, there's a torch and a smoking oven. I think there's some ambiguity as to how that's translated sometimes, but whatever the case, they pass between the different parts of the animals, and then God says that I am establishing a covenant. It says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. So we see again the same kind of thing where in the last portion, after Noah did what God said, and after Noah believed God, he made a covenant with him and with his descendants. And so right here, God makes a covenant that to Abram's descendants, or his seed, he's giving the land of Canaan, all the way from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, which is actually a decent amount bigger than modern day Israel. But again, we see that covenant of the land, again stressing how important it is, this covenant of the land with regards to Abram.
Now, this one's a little different. It's got more detail. The covenant, it establishes the boundary of the land. With this, God tells Abram that his seed is going to go down to another land and be oppressed for 400 years and go down and come back in the fourth generation.
Is that,
all of that?
That is here.
Yes, all of that is right
here.
here.
Oh, wow, yeah. So the Exodus is also prophesied right here.
God,
and the slavery.
Yes. when God establishes this covenant, he's telling Abram he's going to have to wait for a while. But at the same time, he's assuring him that it will happen with a sign. Like we said, lots of the covenants have a sign, like we said before. In this case, it was that with the torch and the whatever the other thing was passing through the pieces of the offerings.
Right.
I believe that occurs elsewhere in the Bible. People pass through dead animals as a way of confirming a covenant.
Really? Where?
In Jeremiah 34, it talks about people making a covenant before God by cutting a calf in two and passing between its parts. All the officials of Judah and Jerusalem do it to make a covenant before God.
All right.
And then they break that covenant. But the point is, that is a way of making a covenant. And God himself does it to show physically, I am making a covenant right now.
Yeah. It was something physical that he could see.
Right. A sign.
Yeah.
That's what Abram asked. Abram had the promise. He believed it.
And he was like,
but
how
at the
do I
same
know?
time, how do I know? And God's like, I'll give you how you'll know. Here's the sign. I'm passing between the offerings. I'm doing it myself.
And we'll see in chapter 17. We haven't discussed chapter 16 yet, but in chapter 17 he gives him another sign, which is the sign of circumcision.
Well, he makes kind of another covenant there.
Yeah. We'll get to that in a little bit.
This covenant here is the nation which I promised you would become is going to inherit this land. They're going to go to Egypt. They're going to come back. They're going to inherit this land forever. That's the covenant here. But the covenant later is going to be even more detailed.
Right. So after God promised Abram a son, Sarai told him, look, I'm too old to have children. So if you want a son, here's my servant girl, Hagar. Take her as a second wife, and I'll have a child through her. So it's kind of a bit messed up, especially because, like we saw in the first portion, the pattern for marriage was a man sticking with his wife. One man, one woman. That was the original pattern that God set up, and this is polygamy.
Yeah.
So, but...
And this is not the only time that there's that concept of having children vicariously through another woman.
We'll get to that later in the Torah. But then Abram does honor Sarai's request, and Hagar does get pregnant. And when Hagar gets pregnant, she starts to mistreat Sarai, even though Hagar is Sarai's slave girl. So she's overstepping her bounds, and so Sarai gets really upset. And Abram's like, do whatever you want. And so does Sarai send her away, or does Hagar just run away?
Sarai treats her so badly that she runs away.
Right, okay. Then we see that Hagar is approached by an angel or a messenger of the Lord. And basically this angel reassures Hagar, your child is going to be a nation, a mighty nation, but you need to submit to Sarai. So for the next 13 years, Hagar and her new son Ishmael live with Abram and Sarai.
The interesting thing here is God has made the covenant with Abram, and Abram believed it. Sarai, though, had like this doubt, like, that's impossible. We need to solve this problem. And so she was trying to force the promise.
Right.
Through her own power.
Yeah.
And figure it out.
Yeah, God didn't specifically say yet that the child of the promise would be through Sarai, but Sarai was like, well, I can't have a kid, so we got to figure out another way to do this.
Right. But in doing that, in trying to come up with a solution to this impossible problem, trying to make a miracle practically,
right.
It doesn't have the effect she wants. All it does is create strife between herself and Hagar.
Right.
And the result being Ishmael. Ishmael himself is going to become a nation, but he's not the son of the promise. So
Right.
Sarai did not do what God wanted.
Right.
She was just trying to come up with a solution. But when we let God solve the problem his way, that's the only way that it works.
Right. So even though Ishmael didn't turn out to be the child that God was talking about, God then says, I'm changing your name. I'm establishing my covenant with you. You're not going to be called Abram, which means exalted father. You're going to be called Abraham, the name we're all familiar with. And we'll call you that because you will be a father of a multitude of nations. Abraham means father of a multitude. And then he goes on to say that he'll be exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. So up until this point, God's been talking about making Abram a nation.
Right.
Here, God's like, I'm going to make you a lot of nations, a lot of peoples. There's only going to be one child of the promise, one child of the covenant that I will establish my covenant with going forward. And he says that that child will be Isaac. But at the same time, Ishmael is part of the fulfillment of his name change of being Abraham, because Isaac goes on to be a nation, or possibly multiple nations, really.
12 princes.
Yeah.
Becoming a great nation.
And also, Abraham will have even more descendants. Abraham is not only the father of Israel. Israel is the chosen nation that God promised to build. But God also said, I'm going to make many nations. And so, even though Ishmael isn't part of the covenant that God establishes, he's not left out entirely, and he still gets the blessings of being a son of Abraham.
Right. He is not the son promised in the previous covenant. But this is a second covenant. This covenant has its own promises, its own signs.
Yeah.
The sign of circumcision is a new part that God's saying to Abraham, this is my covenant. I'm going to make you many nations. I want you to keep my covenant, which is interesting because the other covenant had nothing about Abram needing to do anything.
Right.
But now Abraham is told, keep my covenant
by
circumcising everyone in your house.
Yeah, including yourself.
Including yourself, including Ishmael.
Right.
This covenant is not exactly precisely to Israel.
It's to more people than Israel.
Right. It's to Abraham and his descendants of many nations.
Right.
The sign is circumcision. And he says, Isaac is the son with whom I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant.
Right. Well, circumcision itself is also an everlasting covenant.
Right.
He says that twice.
Right. I will make Ishmael a great nation, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac. It's very interesting because this covenant, on the one hand, says Abraham's going to be many nations. And the sign of that is circumcision for all of his house. At the same time, he's going to establish his covenant with Isaac specifically. So it's showing there's a special promised people coming from Abraham.
Right.
But many nations are coming from Abraham.
Right.
And that's all part of God's plan, his covenant.
Exactly. I think that another fulfillment of this is through the body of Messiah, how all believers are called sons of Abraham through faith.
Right.
Not all believers are Israelites. Doesn't say that they're sons of Israel. There's no verse that says that, but there is a verse that says that they're sons of Abraham. And so the body of Messiah is a fulfillment of this new name that Abraham received. He is the father of many nations physically and the father of many nations spiritually. And he's the father of Israel, the promised nation, who will bless all the families of the earth.
I do have this interesting question, though.
Okay.
As we've already said before, this covenant is to all of Abraham's descendants of many nations, and the sign is circumcision.
Right.
And Ishmael himself was circumcised.
Right.
So is that some kind of requirement for all the descendants of Abraham to be circumcised? I mean, Paul says that every circumcised man is obligated to do the whole Torah.
Mm.
And the Torah was given to Israel, not to the other nations.
Mm. That's a good point.
And the circumcision was also ratified again
Through the Torah.
through Torah and
by
Moses.
Yeah.
If you're saying every descendant of Abraham should be circumcised, wouldn't that make it so every descendant of Abraham has to keep Torah? I think the explanation here is it's every male in Abraham's house.
Mm.
The other nations, like Ishmael, separated from Abraham's house. Ishmael was cast out. All of the sons of Abraham, he gave them gifts, but he sent them away, eastward to the east country, away from his son Isaac. He gave Isaac all that he had. So Abraham's house, the whole thing, went to Isaac.
Okay. So you're saying his other descendants didn't remain part of his house, is what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
And so I think in that way they got separated from the covenant of circumcision, hence it being confirmed to the house of Israel through Moses.
Did the same thing happen with Esau from Isaac's descendants?
Jacob got the birthright and the blessing. So the covenant, which was handed down from Abraham to Isaac, was passed on to Jacob.
Right.
But as for Esau, he lost it because he sold it. He wasn't acting in faith. So in that sense, he wasn't a son of Abraham. Yeah, Esau was already in the country of Edom when Jacob sees him again. So Jacob went back to Canaan. Esau ended up leaving. Abraham's house was in Canaan. And that's where the people of Israel are. All the other nations that Abraham produced as a part of this covenant with Abraham, they all left. They all went out in different directions. Jacob was the one who ended up staying in the land of Canaan. And considering that the Torah is to Israel, and it's pretty clear from Paul, if you get circumcised, you have to keep Torah. I mean, the Jews are the circumcision. There's circumcision and uncircumcision, Jew and Gentile.
I think basically going forward to the time of Moses, in order to become a sojourner and eat of the Passover and stuff like that, you had to be circumcised. So basically, being circumcised was a way of entering Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So it's very interesting. God's covenant is, I will make you many nations, and I will make a special nation with whom I make an everlasting covenant.
Right.
To all those other nations, he didn't promise anything special. It was just the one with whom he made the everlasting covenant.
Right.
Through Isaac.
So before we wrap up, I just want to talk one more time about the promise of the land of Canaan. This is repeated like 4 or 5 times. And it's said that it'll be an eternal possession. It's given as an eternal covenant. It's given forever. It's repeated over and over again that to Abram's promised nation, the land of Canaan will be theirs forever. And so, especially with current events in Israel, there are a lot of people, even in Christianity, there's a decent amount, like not a majority at this point, I don't think, but there's a decent amount who try to negate the promise of the land of Israel and say, God judged the Jews, and so they don't get the land anymore. This promise was given forever. No ifs. Like the promise with Noah, it's an eternal covenant, and there are no conditions. So no matter what Jews do, whether they're good or bad, Israel is our land. Canaan is our land. And that can't be taken from us. And it's our right to live there, and it's our right to defend our nation, and it's ours. And so if you believe in the God of Abraham, then you have to believe that he's the God of Israel and that he gave that land to us.
Yeah. That covenant is an everlasting covenant. It's as immutable as the promise never to flood the earth again. So if that land stops belonging to Israel, if God can nullify that covenant that he made with Abraham, that he swore himself passing through those calves with a sign.
Right.
If he can nullify that, then he can also nullify the covenant to never flood the earth again.
In which case, suddenly God is a liar, he's unjust, and you've just unraveled the entirety of Scripture. So the promise of the land is very foundational, very important, and God reiterates that multiple times in this portion. And we'll see later in Scripture just how important it really is. But I just wanted to really emphasize that.
So I would say big takeaway is just the power of faith. That you need to have the kind of faith that you can act on, trust in God's protection and guidance even when you don't know where you're going.
Right.
Trust him in battle. Trust him in everything. And when you do that, God will be faithful to you.
Right.
And he will count that to you as righteousness, even when you mess up. If you just keep being faithful, keep believing God, then he will stick with you forever.
That wraps up the portion of Lekh-L'kha. Next week, we'll be studying the portion called Vayera, so be sure to join us next week. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to keep posted on new episodes. And if you would, please consider leaving us a donation to support us in making more videos like these. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next week. God bless.